Hey guys, it's Jason Snavely, Certified Wildlife Biologist and founder and president of Drop-Tine Wildlife Consulting, the Drop-Tine Seed Company, and of course, Drop-Tine Podcast. Guys, I've 17 years private wildlife consultant, graduated from Mississippi State University, and one of the things I really enjoy doing is traveling the country and watching clients realize their dreams of taking a small piece of property and turning it into something really, really special. Okay, welcome back to the Drop-Tine Podcast. I know it has been a while. I've after the new year, I hit the road and get down south where the weather's breaking. And I'm a field biologist, which is where I love to be. That's where I learn the most. And obviously that's where I can bring back more in-depth and cutting-edge information to educate my listeners, which is what I really enjoy doing. Unfortunately, I enjoy being outside, so I've been busy, haven't had a chance to record, but I'm really excited about this particular recording. Perhaps should have done it a month ago, but I think now that we have it, we'll have it for future years. I want to real quickly thank everyone for purchasing Spring Reload. We've been shipping that. We started earlier this year, of course, with the pre-orders, and we've already shattered last year's volume by probably 2.5 times to date, and we've got another month or so that we will ship Spring Reload, which I'm super excited to get more of that on the landscape across the country after what we saw last year, the impacts of that management. So really excited about that. Summer Reload, there's a lot of orders in. You can certainly place your order. We're slowly getting that out. The soybeans are typically the last in. We do not use old seed. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of having fresh seed. So kind of a quick note there, and I'm going to jump into this because I know both myself and my guest are in a hurry today and somewhat limited on time. Obviously we talk an awful lot about soil health. It's no secret that I really enjoy soil health, regenerative ag, no-tilling, diverse rotations, cover crops, and of course I'm a microbe geek. I love to get in the dirt and listen to the microbes through CO2 respiration. So today, however, our guest focuses more on the effects of soil management practices on soil physical properties and processes. He's obviously a PhD from Penn State University. He's a professor of soil management and applied soil physics, Penn State University. Dr. Sjoerd Dijker. Now, Dr. Dijker obviously has more depth than what we will talk about today, which is frost seeding. Here it is, March 5th, I believe, and obviously depending on where you're at and what your latitude is, or where your latitude is, I should say, for your hunting property or what it is, you may or may not be able to take advantage of this very unique, simple, practical, and potentially a very good ROI on this technique, potentially, and that's why I wanted to have this podcast today. But frost seeding is something that I think most of us have probably cut our teeth on in the food plotting arena. Very simple, again, economical. You can take a simple hand crank, over-the-shoulder crank, or even a ATV and run it around the field. So it's one of the biggest questions we get all the time is how can we get into soil health and regenerative ag in our food plots for wildlife without spending so much money on roller crimpers and no-till drills and tractors, etc. This is your technique. This is technically an interseeding technique, and I think Dr. Sjoerd Dijker, we're going to call him Dr. Frostseed today. I hope he accepts that. So without any more, Dr. Dijker, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Absolutely. So excited to have you. It's funny. I mentioned to you prior to this that I've always felt like frost seeding is more of an art than anything. And when you do your research, you find some old timers who have been doing who has been frost seeding for years, and it's fun to gain their knowledge. But I've often found conflicting reports on their techniques and their level of success, and I think that's probably just the nature of the beast with frost seeding. So if you don't mind, if you can kind of give us I'll let you give us a quick synopsis or summary of what I mean by frost seeding.
Yeah. So frost seeding is just broadcasting the seed in a living stand. Typically, can either be in small grains or in a pasture, perennial vegetation, and it's done during a particular time of the year, which is right around this time when you have frost at night, and typically the soil will thaw during the day. What you get then is a process of the soil that it starts to kind of heave a little bit due to the frost. You need to have some moisture in the soil. If the soil is very dry, it won't work very well. That's one of the reasons why this technique is not so very suited for sandy soils or soils that are just very dry out very quickly after precipitation. It's at this time of the year, typically our soils are fully saturated, so there's a lot of moisture there. But on some of those somewhat excessively drained soils there, they dry out too fast at the soil surface. But when we get that frosting during the night, frozen water has a lower density, and so it expands. Then we get some, we call it honeycombing of the soil surface, where it becomes very soft and it heaves a little bit. And then if we spread that seed in the morning, early in the morning when the soil's still frozen, then during the day that seed will somewhat be incorporated into the soil naturally.
Very good. Yeah, so it's funny because I think you just hit all my bullet points in one, so we can wrap it up.
Okay, we're done then.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's entertaining because there's not a whole lot to the technique, but I find when I visit with clients and talk to seed customers, there's still some confusion, and we'll work our way through that. And I think most of my listeners are probably very familiar with frost seeding. I know because I get emails, and some of them are as detail-oriented as I am. I'm a note-taker, so over the last 20 years on my farm, which is just off Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania, I'm sitting in Texas right now, and I think we've already hit 70 degrees, so I'm happy to be in Texas this morning, but I should be frost seeding on the farm. But I always tell folks when they can't fully grasp what this means, this time of year, say March, in the early morning, maybe you take your cup of coffee out in the morning to let the dog out to run around and do his thing, and you step off the patio into the yard, and underneath your shoes or your boots, you hear that crunching and crackling sound that almost sounds like you're walking on eggshells. That is the honeycombing, the frost heaving, and this is what we're talking about. And you've got these ridges and furrows in the soil, of course, where there's bare ground, and it's just it's the perfect environment for a very dense, and I'll let you cover some of this, but I try to tell clients all the time, they'll frost seed just about everything they can get their hands on, but the harder seeds, the more dense seeds that can find their way into those furrows, nestle down in there. And as you noted, that was one of my questions for you. I have always found it's best to grab that cup of coffee as first light's coming on. The turkeys sometimes are gobbling, which is a really nice time of year. A lot of folks are thinking about maple syrup, so if you're thinking about maple syrup, it's probably a good time to frost seed. And then, I get out there with a cup of coffee early in the morning. Maybe it got down into the 20s, or really, really low 30s. Typically the 20s are best, I have found. Then as that sun rises over the horizon and it warms it up, from my experience, when we get down to the 20s at night and the 50s or even low 50s during the day, that's the perfect situation for sucking that seed into the ideal depth for that seed to soil contact. So I know I went through a lot, but I'm glad you hit a lot of the bullet points as far as it's best to do it in the morning.
Yeah. So the other thing about that is you want to do it when the soil's still frozen, especially if you use heavier equipment. So if you use a tractor or so, because if later during the day the soil will become a little bit mushy and you start to cause more soil compaction. So
Absolutely.
That's good to do it when the soil's frozen.
Absolutely.
Now, if you walk or if you have an ATV, then that's not such a big concern. But especially heavier equipment, that is very helpful to be on it when it's frozen.
Right, and putting the management perspective or the management regimes into perspective, traditionally, a lot of livestock folks, ranchers, use this technique to improve their hay fields and pastures. We're trying to change the way that we food plot, and I think we're finally doing well. We've got some folks following who we hoped would follow. But the skips and gaps in monoculture clover stands are a thing of the past for my clients anyway, and a lot of folks who are more interested in the regenerative aspect of food plotting. However, we all sometimes end up with gaps and skips, and we don't have much naked soil anymore. It's covered for the most part with plant residue, but I'll admit this time of year I still do go around and look for some areas where we do have those gaps and skips, and obviously if you don't fill them in, you will ultimately end up with plant species that perhaps you may not like. The soil will like it, but it's just simply a reflection of your management. So I think we hammered a bunch there. I did want to ask you a couple more questions as far as snow. So when I mentioned earlier, you talked to some of these old timers, and of course you can find it online now, where a lot of folks will either be a huge fan of broadcasting it in the snow, and then others not so much. Right. So can you talk about snow or no, and include depth of snow, etc.?
Well, I guess here's where the art comes into play. So my experience personally has been very negative with doing this on snow. I did one year my frost seeding on the snow. It was late snow in April, and I was getting really anxious about getting it done. And so we spread the seed on the snow. It was really nice because we could see where the seed was, where it fell. But but we had zero stand. We had no success with it that year. It was very disappointing. So I don't know exactly why that happened, but when you spread on snow, first you don't have the honeycombing underneath there, underneath the snow. The soil typically is there, not frozen under the snow. So then it takes a while before that seed is going to be on the soil, because first the snow has to melt. Then you have the water during snow melt, it can just start running, and your seed goes with it. So I don't know where our seed ended up, but I know that we didn't have a stand that year. Now, others might say, well, we have good success with it, and definitely go ahead with it. I mean, we all have our own experiences, so there's a lot of art in this practice. So I'm not discouraging it, but our experiences were not positive.
Right, and this is where trial and error or trial and failure come in. My experiences in snow mirror yours. I have not had very good luck in snow. In fact, I recently did that. I guess it was last year, and sort of sat back and pondered that. I know a lot of folks think it's great because you can visually see where your coverage was and where you skipped. But immediately, as I feel like I'm throwing a prey species out there, if you will, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I can see it, predators of seeds can also see it. So, I wonder oftentimes if birds get to it, which can be a problem because most smaller, hard, dense, clover seeds now are obviously coated. But I think primarily I never saw or noticed good seed to soil contact when I put it in the snow. I suppose if a guy is at his property and he's going to be gone for a month, perhaps it's worth a shot. But so I'm glad we covered that. I wanted to kind of move on now to some of the best forage species. This is one of the most popular questions I get surrounding frost seeding. People think, this is great. I can get out there and get it done before spring turkey comes, before spring bass fishing comes, before golf or mowing the lawn or whatever. And they'll ask me, can I frost seed soybeans? Can I frost seed, the cereal grains, warm season grasses, forbs? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, almost all of those that you mentioned, I would not frost seed. Like soybeans, I think it's a bad idea because it needs warm soil for germination. And it's such a big seed, too. So although you use the honeycombing, that seed-to-soil contact will be very limited, so I wouldn't do it with soybeans. Regarding warm season native grasses, many of those have fluffy seeds. Another no-no for broadcasting because, you're throwing it with some spreader, and that fluffy seed will just, know where it's going to go. So we were actually discussing with some of my colleagues about orchard grass, and even that cool season grass is also a little bit fluffy and is also then a problem to get it spread well. So the species that I really like is more the legumes that have a small dense seed. It's round and it throws well. So like red clover or yellow blossom sweet clover or white clover. Birchwood trefoil can also be good, although we do like species that germinate relatively quickly, not too slow. They seem to be better. So birchwood trefoil is a little bit slower in germination and early growth than something like red clover, but still in a pasture situation can still be all right. As far as other species go, well, another reason for me to like the legumes is because they fix nitrogen. So we enrich a pasture. Also, they add a high-protein food source then for life. If you are looking for wildlife, they also have flowers, so that can be another benefit if you are interested in insects and attracting birds and stuff like that. So regarding grasses, we talked about it a bit, but I think the only one that I have left is perennial or annual ryegrass that I see could be possible to do it. And regarding the legumes, you do need to inoculate them. You need to make sure they have the rhizobium on them so that you are sure that you're going to get that nitrogen fixation. And regarding many times we also like to have some different species in the mix. So now you need to watch out that the species that you mix are of similar density so that they throw in the same way. So you can't really mix the clovers and the grass because they won't throw the same, and therefore you'll have some swaths where there's only grass and then or grass with clover, and the clovers you will throw them further away. So there will be swaths where there's no grass.
Right, and in the seed industry, we refer to that as ballistics. I think the rifle hunters will
I like that term.
Relate to that. But, it's funny, we used to, I had a blend I called Black Label Legumes, and it was just simply a blend of perennial clovers that we just really, really liked and did really well with across a broad geographical range. And at that time, we simply just used that perennial legume mix to frost seed with good, perhaps good enough success. But for me, good enough typically isn't perfect, and I strive for perfect. So we did some research on our own just with trial and error and found that 3 particular seeds had very similar density, very, very good ballistics. They're round, of course, and they're clovers. So, I have a product I call Arctic Bloom, and there's been a lot of orders for Arctic Bloom this year, which is really exciting to see. But there's been, of course, it has super high germ rates, but in Arctic Bloom, we just finally said, you know what? Let's keep it simple. I mean, there was a time we had alfalfa, we had red, we had white, we had, even some annuals and perennials, which I'll get into that mix here soon. And I just said, let's keep this simple. From my experience, Grassland, Oregon distributes Frosty Berseem, which does very, very good. I can't stress that. And they don't pay me to say that, but it does. It's great for cool, wet soils, which, is typically where we're putting it. And then I added a red clover and a white clover that both seem to do really well. And I pictured us sitting there testing the density of a seed that really is so tiny. But I honestly think one of the metrics that is very important is what you just said, and that's having similar density, similar shape, and that it's round, and then those ballistics so that they propel together and they sort of help one another. Now, if you were to throw in, oh gosh, I watched some videos last night, which I don't normally do, but I wanted to see what sportsmen, hunters, food plotters, and as well as farmers and graziers were seeing online, and they were frost seeding native warm season grasses in Forbes, and saying how successful it is, and I struggled with wrapping my mind around that.
I have a hard time believing that because we often struggle really with the establishment of warm season grasses, and they are so slow to germinate. So even and then they get the first year they get overwhelmed sometimes by weeds, and then it takes a long time to get a stand. And so I would really like to see that seed. At least I'm sure it has the seed to soil contact. Also, this is the soils are very cold now. So for those warm season grasses to germinate, this is not the right time.
That's right.
So
And
I'm really skeptical about that.
I agree with you, and I'm glad you said that. We, from a soil temperature, I try to get folks to forget about planting, whether it's the first weekend of turkey season or trout season or whatever every year. Planting by the calendar, we call it, and instead use a soil thermometer. So I would urge folks to take that soil thermometer out there when you are frost seeding and check your soil temps, and a simple search nowadays, and you can see what native warm season grasses prefer, particular forbs prefer from a soil temp to successfully germinate and have a good start in their life cycle. So very good. The one other that I wanted to ask you about briefly is alfalfa. I always included alfalfa.
Yeah.
What's your I know this is kind of what's your
interesting
experience with alfalfa?
You asked me that because I was working with some educators who have a lot of experience with in the seed industry and with pastures and grazing, and we were working on a fact sheet on this and discussing about the species. And I looked around and what some other universities are publishing about this, and they all feature alfalfa in their recommendations. And so when we talked about it, we decided to remove it because it's of its cost. That's probably the major reason. So we decided to take it out and not use it, not recommend it for frost seeding. I think it's when this is a method, it's not foolproof. So you're not always going to have success, and so you don't want to use a very expensive seed. And also you want to keep your rates low so that if it fails, you're not you're spending a lot of money unnecessarily. So that's my little spiel.
Yeah, we have found, I think that's more not necessarily trying to keep it as incorporating cheap seed, but does the return on the investment warrant using that particular seed at that particular cost? And I would agree with you completely on alfalfa. It always frustrated me because I would see and hear where others were using it, and I guess people can report whatever they want. But I just wasn't seeing alfalfa come on after frost seeding at all. So I appreciate that input. I would agree with that. I'm glad you removed it from the fact sheet. I think too many of these fact sheets and videos just simply reiterate what they heard from another one. So we do appreciate that. Now I want to touch a little bit. I believe you mentioned the being slow to germinate when you're talking about native warm season grasses, obviously due to the cooler temperatures. So what would you have to say about annuals versus perennials? Obviously, we're primarily talking about clovers here. How do you feel about that?
So we didn't really include annuals in our fact sheet, I guess, because we're looking more about. So the two scenarios we are considering is into small grains, where we are then after small grain harvest. This is for just in agricultural application. Mm-hmm. So they grow wheat or barley, winter wheat, and then you frost seed around this time of the year. Red clover is one very good one, or I like also the sweet clover. But then after harvest, the clover is underneath. It sits underneath, and now the light comes through and it starts growing, and you have a clover stand. And then we have the rest of the year for that clover to grow. And so red clover is a short-lived perennial, and then sweet clover is a biennial. So they go through the life cycle, and they will be there until next year. And then we terminate them next year. Some farmers, they use them also for forage. They cut them for forage, although the sweet clover, you have to watch out with that because it has a substance called coumarin in it that is a blood thinner, can create some livestock issues if it is not in a mixture. Mm-hmm. If it is a predominant species in the pasture or in the field.
Toxicity.
But but both of them are not annual, so I don't know. I mean, perhaps you can give your perspective on using annuals. I would say then you need annuals that reseed on their own, isn't it?
We do, yeah. We incorporate, and of course, I didn't put it in Arctic bloom because we are looking typically for longer lasting. From a perennial standpoint, but I also will use annuals, 3 or 4 different varieties of annuals, and they are, as you hit the nail on the head, they're aggressive, super aggressive reseeders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, that might work. I don't know.
Now, when you say terminate, are you? Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. When you said. We focus more on agricultural use, so then typically we don't let our species go to seed. And,
yeah,
that's the difference then.
Yeah, and we're okay, typically, depending on your goals and objectives for that particular plot, but we're okay with obviously having volunteer annual clovers pop back up in the future. So,
Yep.
Well, good deal. I was hoping you had some science, but again, Sometimes context comes into play, and if you're, from an agricultural standpoint, it's a little bit different. I always say we're spoiled as wildlifers because we can have these quote-unquote dirty plots and have a volunteer crimson clover pop up from time to time, and it's really it's just a benefit. It's an asset to us. So now when you're talking termination, obviously you're talking about chemical termination.
I'm a big proponent of no tillage from the point of soil health. So I always shrink a little bit when I hear people, well, we're going to plow in that cover crop and it's going to be great. I'm thinking, well, that tillage is going to destroy a lot of the soil health benefits that you are going to get from that cover crop. So that's where I prefer to kill it in another way. If it's still actively growing and we need to plant another crop, then I would recommend a chemical herbicide to terminate it.
Okay.
Now people get sometimes creative and overgrazing or all kinds of things are also possible. So, but typically, yes, in our experience, but this is again where we are a little bit different from the wildlife world, perhaps, that we want to have a clean start.
Sure. For
our next crop.
And that's one of the reasons that we do like the annuals, because we can typically crimp terminate the annuals. So I have we made a blend called Grand Slam, which has four of our favorite best producing annuals that has actually turned over some really good soil health calculation scores from the Haney test in Texas. So obviously those roots are doing their thing to promote the biological life in the soil. But all right, well, good enough on that. I also another area, I'm sure you've talked to your colleagues when you were working on this fact sheet, that I often get in discussions with clients on, is planting rates. So obviously we're not establishing, typically you're not establishing a new plot necessarily when you frost seed. You're simply just revitalizing an existing stand or filling in again those skips and gaps. So the question often comes up: are we to go in with a full rate? Obviously, it's it's a relatively low success rate on take. So how do you feel about planting rates?
So we keep our seeding rates low because we want to again keep it cost effective. So if we have a failure, we can do it again next year, or typically next year.
That's interesting, and
not bite ourselves in the.
Yeah, that's one area where I often find, some conflict with some of the universities and the extension departments. Is, we have found that if we go higher, now I guess it's perhaps a function of your budget, but if we go higher of up to 15 pounds to the acre, now again we're typically wildlifers, and oftentimes we're not looking at that mixed hayfield, that mixed stand where there's a dominant stand of grasses, and we're just sort of supplementing the legumes. Oftentimes the legumes represent the main percentage or the primary plant type, functional plant group in the mix. So that's interesting. Have you done any work with higher rates?
So in our when we do it in small grains, then we do use the higher rates. So for example, red clover alone, we recommend 10 to 15 pounds per acre, and on sweet clover, 15 to 20 pounds. Yeah, those are the species we recommend mostly for the small grains, because there we don't have the opportunity to come back next year. we want to get success, and we don't have a next,
Okay.
such as in pasture situations.
Right. With
So we reduced the rates a little bit on cut it about in half for the pasture renovation. Also, because there is already vegetation there.
Right.
We're just filling in some gaps, and it's just an addition to what's already there.
Good deal. That makes sense. And I'll just throw this in there for those who send the emails and have questions about Arctic bloom. I sell it in 25-pound bags. I just find that's a good size to have and keep. It stores very well. And we recommend 15 to 20 pounds per acre. We've just found over the last, 15 years, we've been using that mix or a similar mix. We tried to stick around that 12 to 15 pounds, but we continued to see a return in that 15 to 20 pounds. I think a lot of that is that, many of us wildlifers, and I'll lump myself in here. We're not the most efficient farmers in the world, for sure. So
well, if you have only a small area, and money is not of a big concern, then the higher rates are definitely you're going to have a higher probability of success.
Right.
But when it fails, you also have a high cost. So.
Okay. Yeah. Now moving on to the next one, which is actually an interest of mine. I've gotten into this discussion with some colleagues on when we actually see the primary benefits of frost seeding. So in other words, if you and I were out there today in the field, frost seeding this morning, are we going to see more short-term benefits or long-term benefits? In other words, will we, by benefits, I'm obviously talking vegetative above-ground growth, root growth, and then from a wildlife perspective, I guess I'll change it up a little bit, assuming we're not really getting in there to terminate it necessarily. We're looking for long-term benefits. So, what do we see a mixture of those short-term versus long-term, or how does that work?
Well, of course, you get the added value of the vegetation there for wildlife. That's probably, you see that in late summer or so, that you have a more diverse pasture there. You get those benefits, but I'm really excited about the soil benefits. Especially so you notice that a lot of these frost-seeded species are legumes, so they fix nitrogen. So we are going to enrich our soil. As that legume fixes nitrogen, and then mostly it's related to some parts of the plants dying off. Like when they get grazed, some part of the root system dies off that then mineralizes, and that releases the nitrogen then. Although there is now also some evidence of some direct release of nitrogen to accompanying plants, but it's not large quantities. But over time, you get an enrichment of the soil, so your vegetation will become more productive. And then the soil benefits as far as soil health, well, that's of course part of soil health is the better fertility, but also the higher microbial activity because of that enrichment. But we also have these different types of root systems that we're putting in out there. Like you look at sweet clover roots; those are big tap roots, and that's a species that was traditionally always promoted for its soil health or soil structure improvement and alleviation of compaction. So you get an improvement of the biological and the physical properties of the soil because of that root growth.
Right. That's interesting. when I was developing a blend I call Spring Reload, I include sweet clover in a lot of my blends because it, for some of the benefits you just mentioned, and we've used them on client properties all over the country for the same reason. But one thing we found out about sweet clover is it's a species. We talk about species complementariness, and it's a species that plays well with others. So it's very complementary with some of the grasses and then the forbs and so on and so forth. But there was something else that I was going to note when we were talking about short term versus long term, and you hit it on the head there. That was pretty fascinating. There's obviously a nitrogen capture, as traditionally, and this is the fun part about education. Sometimes we have to reteach or relearn, and maybe it perhaps wasn't acting exactly like we thought it would. And this is why me, as a wildlife biologist, that's why I enjoy the microbial activity below. Everybody talks about and sees, and it's tangible what's above ground, but I'm more fascinated to dig a hole, to be honest with you, and get down in there and see what's going on. And I personally think that there's probably a range in that topic of, do we see a nitrogen benefit while the legume is alive, or do we capture it all, or a percentage, maybe 80% of it or 70% when it dies, or as you've alluded to, if it's overbrowsed and just quite frankly stressed to the point that it's that nitrogen's mineralizing now and reaches the organic fraction. So I think there's probably a continuum, and I think it's not as simple as we like to think it is. But one reason I think that that there's a nitrogen benefit to companion plants is, years ago when we were stuck on these monoculture clover plots because the older, more entrenched food plot marketing companies were racing to breed this superior clover that would grow 200 inches of antlers. We noticed that there was something going on where there was this constant struggle in these monoculture clover plots, which we were obviously pumping so much nitrogen into the soil, throwing that carbon-nitrogen balance out of whack. And as a result, the soil was throwing grasses at us. And for years and years, we purchased extremely expensive and caustic chemicals, selective herbicides that killed grasses. We also killed forbs, but it was interesting that the grasses were typically to blame for a clover plot getting to that point where you throw your hands up in the air and say, all right, I'm going to kill it all and start over. So what we started doing years ago is taking the cereals, so barley and oats, and typically barley and oats, but you can use other cereals depending on your location. And we would get in there, so we would do a frost seeding, get that over with, and next would come the barley and oats into those monoculture or even clover/chicory stands. And we found if we got an early seeding or an early planting of those cereals, those cool season cereals, into those clover, even if they were dense clover stands, those cereals exploded. And obviously that soil is carbon starved, has plenty of nitrogen. There's a complementary thing going on there, symbiotic relationship between the legume and the grass, and not to mention the number of insects that then it attracted. And obviously right around the corner from that time frame that I'm talking about is turkey season. And obviously antler growth and lactation, and clients were seeing an incredible response from that technique. So we now have a product that's barley and oats, and folks will say, "Boy, I know you're into diversity." That's not a whole lot of diversity right there, but the application of that's a failure on my part, and lacking education. The application for that is to drill it into those stands to try to get that carbon-nitrogen balance back, but it's also, you throw those succulent cereals early in the spring, during turkey season, and again, antler growth, fawning, lactation, all that.
Mm-hmm.
So
those cereals, when they're in the vegetative stage, they have very good feed value, so absolutely.
Yeah. Well, very good.
It's when they get dry and just mature that's when the feed value goes down. but of course can still be a benefit for the soil.
Sure, absolutely.
That residue stays for there, and it will just decompose slowly over time. It will still feed soil. I always like the perspective from one of the farmers I work with. He's an adaptive grazier, and he always said, my first priority is to feed my soil. When I feed my soil, and here is a person who lives off the livestock sales, he didn't have anything else, a full-time farmer. And he said, I first have to make sure my soil is healthy. And others were saying, well, think about the herd below the ground.
That's right.
There's been just as much livestock underneath. I mean, many more in number, but in weight, very similar to, say, a cow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And John
we need to think about feeding that. Otherwise,
John Sticka's book comes to mind. I think it's the soil manual. I'm sure you read it. It's an incredible little read. It's a tiny little book, but he talks about the same thing. And I think personally, I know after working with Dr. Rick Haney for almost 2 years now, in my passion, which is soil biology, it's the microbial activity down there that he's referring to, that below ground herd, is in fact the driver of plant nutrition and, quite frankly, the soil water supply. So if we're not paying attention to what's below the ground, we're way behind the 8 ball, and it all starts there with wildlife as well, and of course works its way up. So that's interesting that he had that perspective. Talking about the cattlemen, I guess one of my last points on frost seeding is obviously I think you mentioned it in the beginning of the conversation that we're not really we need some seed to soil contact, right? So if you have a thick stand, a dense hayfield, you perhaps may not have the ideal situation for frost seeding. Right. So I know a lot of cattlemen will tell me that they will get in there. We did this in Georgia, actually, with a herd of bison, and graze it very, very low, very close to the ground, so that existing plant residue goes through the animal. Now, I know there was a popular YouTube video from a wildlife, what would you call it? He's a biologist, but he has a web show where he was burning to remove the residue from a field, not necessarily the frost seed, but why you would export that much carbon is way beyond me. But I found it interesting here recently. I was on my Pennsylvania farm for a week, doing some consulting in that region. And of course I was out in the field, just kind of scouting around. And I noticed, with it being a cold winter this year, a fair amount of snow in Pennsylvania, that is, the deer had grazed heavily on some old, and I have some highly stoloniferous clovers that have, quite frankly, they've been planted there for a very, very long time. And they were digging down through the soil, and these clovers were underneath or included in a spring and fall reload. It's just a multi-species cover crop, biological primer, if you will. And they were literally eating the horizontal roots off of the clover and digging down in that soil. And I thought to myself, this is no different than grazing it super tight with cattle. So it's the ideal situation to get in there and frost seed. Would you agree?
Yeah, if you have a very dense stand there, then that is not a very good candidate for frost seeding unless you can open it up in some way. So definitely then close grazing in the fall would be a good scenario for setting yourself up for frost seeding in this around this time of the year.
Very good. Very
you need
good.
or it has to be a somewhat a weak stand. It's to fill in open spots. If that little seedling has to fight very aggressively growing grass stand, that just overpowers it, then that will not have a lot of success. So we need to have somehow create that niche for that small, tiny plant that you're going to plant there to have success.
Good deal. Well, can we call you Dr. Frostseed?
I wouldn't go there because I still have a lot to learn in this whole field. So
yeah, we all do, and I'm glad that you're focusing on it. I know it's just a small part, again, of your area of expertise, which is quite broad. I know I've sort of read up on some of your papers, and it's pretty fascinating because a lot of it overlaps with what we've spoken about on this podcast and what we enjoy to do. So, that includes the continuous no-till and diverse crop rotations, and I think you've done. I know your passion is ensuring, cover cropping on these fallow fields, these periods with obviously living vegetation and roots in the soil. And then I know I've seen you do some work on soil compaction and erosion, and of course you mentioned the nitrogen fixation, which is a no-brainer. I don't know why more of us are not taking advantage of that. But is there anything, first of all, before we kind of move on from surrounding this whole the art and science of frost seeding that you feel like we've missed?
Well, why I was so interested in this is because it is a way of establishing a legume. It's often we find it very challenging to get legumes included in our crop rotations, and this is a great way of accomplishing that. And you use no-till practices, so you don't have to plow the soil up. Very cost effective. So I think there's a great option that we have available to get more diversity out there. I really find the challenge for us is to include more biological mechanisms of fertilization, and these legumes can really help us reduce need for any nitrogen fertilizer. So I think it is a great option that we have.
Very good. I agree. That's all good stuff. Now, is there anything that you I know one thing I wanted to ask you about. I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Groff or not from Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, he's a good resource. We keep missing each other. He was going to stop off at my farm this week, and I said I'm kind of in Central Texas, so that's not going to work. But I have some new technology for infield soil health testing that I wanted to show him. But one thing I learned from Steve, and I was curious to know if you have ever done it, but Steve, as you know, is always on the cutting edge and doesn't have a problem trying something and failing. But have you ever seen Steve do what he calls freeze seeding with his drill?
So drilling into the frozen soil?
Yes. Yeah,
I saw him do that, yes.
That's kind of fascinating. I started doing that last year, and there's so many variables at play. You can't really shrink it down to one that I can, say, things are thriving so well on my farm. But I feel like I got a very good response from actually getting my drill out. I had it out in November, December, January. I don't think there was a month last year where I didn't have the drill out, and people thought I was crazy for running my drill all winter. But hey, what the heck? The seed doesn't grow in the barn.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, very good. This is I've been wanting to do this podcast for a long time. I feel like you're on the cutting edge. It's really interesting and kind of cool that you're in Pennsylvania, and some of these other topics that you're working on are extremely important. And I'm so glad that Penn State has you, considering that your focus is on soil health, and I know you're a huge proponent of no-till and diversity, and of course crop rotations. So,
well, it was really interesting talking to you, Jason, and I appreciated the new perspectives on using frost seeding for wildlife. That had not been something I had really worked on a lot, but I see that it can really have some great applications there.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate that. This is one of those things where we learn so much from everybody, and like from frost seeding standpoint, I've learned so much from clients of mine because they're aggressive, they're not afraid of failure, and I think some of these practices, even though they were perhaps done extensively in the 20s and 30s and 40s, before we thought we had to synthetically prop up crops and till to death, I think many of these arts have been lost, and these practices are sort of getting lost in the grand scheme of things. So I was super excited when I know you've presented some very good presentations and seminars at some of the no-till conferences and cover crop conferences. So I'm super excited and glad that you're focusing on this. We need field observations are so crucial, but having your research behind it for field guys like me to lean on is super helpful. So just want to acknowledge you for that and thank you. And there's probably a million other topics that you could be researching. We do appreciate you. And there's an open invitation if you're ever east about an hour and 20 minutes in Columbia County to visit the farm, and I'd be happy to show you, be excited to show you what we're doing and what we've done.
Great. I'll stop by when I'm in the neighborhood.
There you go. Well, all right, Doc, we do appreciate that, and when you get some more research conducted and some more results and perhaps learn a little bit more on the art of frost seeding, please do let me know, and we'll have you back on to give everybody an update.
All right, great.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, and have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
All right.
Bye.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Again, I apologize. It's been so long. If it were up to me, while I say that, I love being in the field. I love podcasting. I have 3 different podcasting units now set up in 3 different states, so I can hit home base at some point and try to keep up with them. I've got a mobile unit now, so I want to take them on the road. I just went to South Carolina and really had a great visit there, and then some other visits after that and before that, where this platform would have been perfect for you all to listen to other clients and some of their frustrations. So I'll do more of that in the future. But thanks again for listening. And again, those of you who listen often know I listen to a lot of podcasts. This is purely educational. This is my give back. I love doing this. I love reporting what we're finding. I can't even scratch the surface of the things, the topics that we're learning on prescribed fire, soil health, timber stand management, silviculture, predator-prey relationships, harvest strategies, population censusing, hunting techniques. There's just so much that goes on. When you're fortunate like me and you're able to travel all over the country for 20 years now and work with clients who I've learned far more from than they'll ever learn from me. So if you don't mind, obviously we don't have advertisers. If you could please make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Some folks just download individual podcasts, but it helps us if you subscribe. And then, of course, I really like those reviews and ratings. So if you could give us hopefully a 5-star rating, and the reviews they help beyond what you could ever imagine. So if you could take a minute and let potential listeners know what you like about it. Trust me, your neighbor won't look. They just don't tell them about it. But super, super appreciate that. And again, all the seeds are available this year. We have not put it on the website, but I'll make a note for those of you who are interested. Actually, it was available last year also, but I didn't promote it that much. We're big fans of pollinators. So Pollinator Preserve is in fact still available. Pollinator Preserve was sort of 3 different kits shoved together in one to make a super diverse blend. And then I added some forbs to it. We also have a warm season, in quotes, showy plot or pollinator blend. That is more of the warm seasons. That these are the flowers that a lot of people want, around their house or in particular entry maybe a driveway on the way to their home. They are costly, but we do have that blend. We also have a blend that you could plant. Pollinator Preserve does best if you plant it in the spring. It's a full season. Some of those plants take quite a while to flower, but some folks miss that period because they're busy or they're traveling or whatever. So we do have a pollinator blend that you could plant in the warm season and still capture some really great flowers. And then we also have a pollinator blend that you could plant late in the year and have fall blooms. So it's a crazy spectrum there, very, very diverse, lots of options. Again, I only have Pollinator Preserve on the website right now, but if you're interested in another one, you could certainly email me, jason@droptineseed.com. And I enjoy, now that I'm on that, all the emails, even some texts. Please understand, I love responding to everyone. I personally feel if you took the time to send an email, I should take the time to respond. However, the emails are just overwhelming. They're awesome. Keep them coming. But I do travel a lot, and this time of year I try to focus on my clients and getting their properties set up for the upcoming season, which comes a lot quicker than all of us realize. So with that, I've spoken long enough. Thank you to everyone. And I've got some incredible topics I want to talk about here, very diverse group of them, but we'll get to them, and thank you so much.